So are we, that's my first question. So welcome. There are literally less than dozens of us here. I appreciate you guys. Three strong. So I'm Karen Payne, and my co-host for this event is Andrew Taylor, and we are very happy to welcome you to the repeat session of the GORC Interest Group. You should have a link in the chat to both the meeting notes and the slides. Those meeting note links will take you to the repeat session above it. If you're interested, you can scroll up and see the original session of this that was held. Yeah, this is going to be happening in several parts. Andrew and I are going to do a little tag teaming here. So should I? I'll
do it. Yeah, because I've got the first block. So how about I do it?
Okay, sounds good.
So let me just share my screen and go into present mode. Okay, so as Karen said, some of these slides have been created by our co-chairs, Sarah Jones and Mark Leggett, who have scheduling conflicts of varying kinds and can't be with us. What we would like to do this morning is start off with an introduction and some of the previous work that we've been doing. I want to then talk through some slides that Sarah's created, looking at what we're calling our typology. Karen is then going to impersonate Mark Leggett and talk about the Global Open Science Cloud and the working groups and how that connects to the GORC activity. Karen's then going to go on and talk about what's been happening in a working group that's associated with this interest group. And then we're going to close off by talking about next steps. You'll note that the typology and diagram section has listed as 45 minutes. And that's because there are some questions at the end that we want to explore with you. We're a relatively small group at the moment. So I'm not sure whether the discussion times are necessarily going to go for 45 minutes. And we may end up finishing a little bit early, but let's see how we go. So please feel free to ask questions as we go through. So let me start off with an introduction and welcome. And perhaps it might just be useful for everyone on the call to say, well, first of all, if you can put your details in the table, in the collaborative notes, just your name, your email address, and your affiliation. But I would like to hear from people what it is they're hoping to get out of this session. So I'm Andrew Taylor. I work for the Australian Research Data Commons. I'm one of the co-chairs. And I think what I'm hoping to get out of this session is to hear from you about whether the way we're thinking about the commons makes sense to you. We have some specific questions we want to ask, but in general terms, that's what I'd like to get out of it. Karen, maybe if you could go next.
Yep. As the one of the co-chairs of the working group that's working under the interest group, I actually had the same desire that Andrew does to make sure that what we're doing makes sense and the way that we're presenting it makes sense, and to see if any folks here have any feedback about things that we should be aware of. So that's where I am.
Okay, thank you. Junichi Onami, and I'm sorry, I don't know which way around you put your names, and therefore I'm not sure which is your family name, but perhaps if you could say what you were hoping to get from this session, if that's all right.
Okay. Hello, everyone. This is Junichi Onami in National Institute of Japan, and now it's time is 8 o'clock in the morning in Japan. So I'm also very sleepy because I just get up. But yeah, I'll try to do my best. And in this GORC, I wanna communicate about the discovery infrastructure in many of global science institute, and how can we communicate or make network in global infrastructure? And I want to catch these standards in this field. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, the topic of cross discovery between different national and regional infrastructures is something that Karen's group has been looking at. We actually had a case study on that in
Yes.
in that session. So this is something that we
Yes.
are also very interested in. So thank you.
Thank you.
Rory.
Hi, everyone. This is Rory McNeil from Edinburgh, Scotland. That's why I'm wearing this coat, because it's freezing here. I'm from Research Space, which provides RSpace, which is an electronic lab notebook whose kind of focus is interoperability with other tools that would be operating in a data commons. And I have been actively working with Sarah and others, including people from ARNet and Mark and Jeff Moon from Canada and people from other NRENs on a group which is not formally recognized by the RDA, but it's called How NRENs Can Support the Data Lifecycle. So I was actually expecting to see Sarah here tonight, and it seems to me like there's a lot of overlap between what we've been discussing in that group, which is basically around a data commons that would be provided by NRENs or similar national bodies. But I see Sarah's not here. So I'm kind of curious to see how the activities of this group and the thoughts relate to what we've been discussing, and I'm suspecting they're going to be quite similar.
Okay, thank you. Sarah apparently had a pressing dinner date, so you can give her grief next time you see her.
Okay.
I mean, prioritizing dinner over a meeting with us, honestly, what's wrong with her life? Frankie.
Hi everyone, nice to be here, and at a decent time for Australia, at least.
Yay!
Yeah, I know. It's like this is very sophisticated.
Unusual.
I know. So I guess my reasons for being here are twofold. One, I'm really interested to know how global commons is really coming on and what it looks like, and very keen to understand how the sort of working group offshoots, what the outputs have been of that. I've not been really able to attend many of those other sessions. So my plan is to look at the recordings, but plans are often derailed when you want to go back retrospectively and have a look at these things. So anyway, keen to find out what you guys have been doing. And I am the tab liaison for this group. So making sure that if there's anything you guys need from the organization as a whole, I can feed that back into the RDA machine alongside with the secretariat help, of course. But yeah, happy to be here. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Frankie. Okay, so let me go back one. So for people who haven't joined this group before, this is what we said when we proposed the group to RDA. We said we wanted to give people a neutral place where people have conversations about this idea of an open research commons. We wanted to provide a space where people could raise topics of mutual interest and track trends, very similar to what Frankie just said. And we said we were going to try and reach a shared understanding of what a commons was in the research data space. So what do you need to build a commons? And picking up on one of the themes that Junichi mentioned, how can you coordinate this at a global level? So the interest group's been meeting for a couple of years now, I guess. And recently we've spun off a working group that Frankie just referred to, and Karen will provide a report back from the working group in a little while. So one of the things that we've been doing, and it does seem to have taken a while, is work out or agree on what are the components or the building blocks of a commons. If you're going to build an open research commons, what are the pieces that you need to bring together? And we started out by looking at lots of different sources of existing commons activities that we could draw on. So at the time we started, the National Institute of Health in the United States had a data commons that they badged as that, which has now kind of evolved into something else. We looked at the European Open Science Cloud. We looked at the World Data System. Karen is the Director of the International Technology Office for the World Data System, if I've got that right, Karen.
Well done.
Near enough. And the thing that is now called the Canadian Alliance, but at the time was called the New Digital Research Infrastructure Organisation. So all of those had different ways of conceptualising how you might think about a commons. And what we tried to do is we tried to abstract across those and come up with a shared definition that we could all fit under. So the NIH Data Commons stack was relatively straightforward: compute at the bottom, data on top of that, and a set of services and tools on top of that, with services, workflows, some kind of app store. So this is a model that I think will be familiar to many of you. EOSC, the European Open Science Cloud, viewed things not so much as a technology stack, but a set of things that you needed. So they said, well, you need an agreed architecture, you need fair data and fair data management, you need a set of services, you need ways of getting to EOSC, interfaces for accessing EOSC. You need rules of participation. So the first four are, if you like, yeah, okay, I can see how they fit together. The last two are things that EOSC emphasized in particular: the need for rules of participation, who gets to play in EOSC and under what conditions. And there was the last physical plenary that was held in Helsinki. There was a quite active rules of participation session where they were testing those rules with a variety of people who came to the Helsinki plenary. And governance, ensuring that you set up appropriate governance for this large European Open Science Commons. World Data System has what they call their web stack view. Again, you see the governance included in this. This model also introduced the importance of standards as a way of governing how you fit things together, and the role of stakeholders. Not entirely sure that Darth Vader is the kind of stakeholder we necessarily want, but stakeholders are absolutely important for creating a commons. And again, this is a relatively straightforward technology stack: hardware, OS on top of that, database and web server on top of that, and then user interfaces and client software on the outside. So the client software is the outer ring. The Canadian view, again, some similar ideas here. You've got underpinning network, storage and compute. The role of the NRENs, of course, is critical for moving data around and connecting systems together. The Canadian view then said, well, you've got the data repositories on top of that. You've got services that interoperate with those underlying repositories, and you have a range of data platforms and interfaces and research platforms and tools. And off to the side, I guess to indicate that they span across all of this. On the left, the importance of international standards and best practices. Again, if you're trying to tie these things together internationally, you need to be looking to international standards rather than doing your own thing. And on the right, the importance of making sure that all of this stuff is fair. And I think, Karen, correct me if I'm wrong, but the point about the fair box spanning all of this is that you want the platforms to be fair, and the data and the services and the underlying repository infrastructure. So FAIR was originally designed just to refer to data, but the idea of fairness, findability, accessibility, interoperability, reusability is now being expanded out and applied more broadly. And in fact, running in parallel with this session is a group that's co-chaired by one of my staff, Kerry Levitt, who is looking at what FAIR might mean for virtual research environments. And of course, RDA has also got a group that is kind of wrapping up in the next 6 months, which is looking at FAIR for research software. So this idea of fairness applied to a range of kinds of elements of a commons is, I think, quite an important one, and we'll see more developments in that over time. So what we did was we took all of those and we tried to boil them down to, if you like, a set of things that we could all agree on. And so this is, on the right hand side, the technology stack is incredibly boring. You've got infrastructure, you've got data, and you've got software on top of that. And obviously you can differentiate software into repositories or databases or user interfaces or APIs, but at the highest level it's software. But what we've realized over the last year, and you'll have seen some of these elements in those previous diagrams, is that you have a whole pile of things that we're calling here supporting elements. So what are the kinds of elements that need to support the technology, if you like, or the core elements on the right-hand side? And so these are things that we've seen already. Rules of participation, we stole from EOSC. Standards and interoperability, we stole from, I think, WDS and the Canadians. Human capacity, the importance of the people to make all of this work. Not sure where that came from. That's been a theme in a number of national discussions. The importance of engaging with the communities. So this is something that WDS is particularly strong on, engaging with the domain communities that contribute to the world data system. The importance of sustainability, making sure that what you're building is not just something that's going to live for a year or two, but is something that will be sustained and will support the research lifestyle cycle. And then governance, which is absolutely something that came through strongly in EOSC. So that's where we've landed, and I've got some questions on that on the next slide, but that's where we've landed at the moment as the high-level elements of a commons. Now, one of the themes that came out of earlier meetings is, well, what do you mean by sustainability? And what do you mean by rules of participation? And so we've identified that we need to source agreed definitions for each of those so that it's clear what we mean when we talk about each of those. The CASRE definitions, if you're familiar with them, have been suggested as a starting point. And obviously this particular image has been done by someone with zero graphical skill. That would be me. So the plan is that we're going to get the graphics done by someone who can actually do graphics. But we thought it might be useful to have a bit of a discussion with the group that are here at the moment, looking at these 4 questions. So firstly, does this idea of core elements and supporting elements work for you? Secondly, what are the aspects of the governance or the rules that need to be in place to make this work? Thirdly, are there cross-cutting elements that we need to kind of cut across all of this? And fourthly, are there resources that might help to find these elements? And the reference to the International Models Working Group, I think, will make more sense when Karen presents on that later on. But it's, if you like, definitions that we could perhaps use. So what we might do is I might just pause I'll leave the slide up so you've got the questions up. But it would be good if we could have a discussion about those questions now and get your feedback on or your thoughts on those. So maybe if people could turn their videos back on for the discussion session. And I don't think we need to worry too much about turn taking for this. Please just speak up. I don't think we need to do hand raising or anything like that. So maybe if we start with the first one, this idea of core and supporting elements, does that make sense? Let me just go back to the core and supporting elements. No, not that. That. So does that idea work? Is that helpful? Confusing?
So. I think it is. I think on the core elements front,
Yep.
that infrastructure box, that is possibly more complex than that suggests. You know, that's a big beast with storage, compute, and network all bundled into a simple infrastructure component. But
yep.
Yeah, so I should imagine that when you unpack all of those components, that's where the complexity comes in. But I like the way that it's presented, and that makes sense to my sort of ordered brain. The way my brain works, that works.
Okay. Karen, I can't type. Well, actually, I probably can type. Let me see if I can.
Let's not type anything about the way that Frankie's brain is ordered in the notes.
No. I'm just going to dive out of that version of the document so that I can get to something I can type into. So I just want to make sure that I can capture that. Okay. So hopefully you're still seeing the slide window.
We're seeing, your Google Slides.
Yep, that's fine. That's what I want. I'm just not going to bother putting it into slide share mode for now so that I can type in. Okay, Frankie. Infrastructure too complex. Yep, okay. Well, it's not too complex. If anything,
it's overly simplified.
Yeah.
The diagram is overly simplified, but I can understand that given that there's so many elements within the diagram, you kind of have to do that.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense.
But maybe if you did mention that you're going to get some sort of graphics or user interactivity specialists come in and maybe draw that up again, maybe they can tackle some of that.
They are, but I suspect if I think about our comms people, they're going to say, okay, great, but what do you want that to look like? How do you want us to describe the complexity?
They're not going to be able to color palette across it, and that'll be done.
Yeah, so we're going to actually have to unpack the complexity ourselves. But maybe you're right. Maybe what we need to do is we need to think about, because I agree with you. There's a lot in the infrastructure box. There's also a lot in the software box. I mean, in theory, the software box is everything from the underlying operating system through to the platforms you build on top. So maybe what we need to do is we need to, as the NIH diagram did, need to unpack that a little bit. And, spread out to the right-hand side what we mean by some of the things in software, what we mean by some of the kinds of data, what we mean by some of the things in compute, because I can absolutely see how that could work.
So I have two comments. The first is I like the separation into the two different categories of elements. Just an observation. The core elements seem to be things, like they're hard things.
Yep.
And the supporting elements seem to be I don't quite know what the word is. They're processes or people or I don't know what the word is, but they're what I mean.
Tangible and intangible is
that's
what I'm
right.
going with in the
Right. So I think core and supporting, that's one way of thinking about it. But if you could argue that actually the intangible things are all also just as important. They're just intangible. So but anyway, so that's one observation. So I like the differentiation, but the terminology maybe could be
unhelpful. Yeah.
But not that it's unhelpful, but it's not complete. Maybe it could be thought of in two different ways. So that's probably my fundamental point. And my second point is just the way I think about it. If you're thinking on the core elements, that the infrastructure is kind of at the core, and then there's something on top of that and something on top of that. to me, the software and data are flipped. The software is a part of, is kind of sits on top of things like storage, compute, and then data is produced by the software. So I would flip the two, the order of the software and the data, but that's just the way I think about it.
So that's a really interesting point. And I'm actually going to have to think about that one a bit more. So I'm probably guilty for having put them that way around. Well, guilty is perhaps too strong a word. Responsible for having put them that way around. And I guess that's because I was thinking of it from. So I'm just processing this as I do it, which is why it's not going to sound very coherent. I think I was thinking about it from the outside in. So as a user, if you imagine the user sitting above this stack, so a little bit like the WDS stack, the user's on the outside and they're using software to interact with the elements of the commons. And so from that point of view, it's user, then the software, and then the data that the software works on, and then the infrastructure. But you're absolutely right, Rory, that the data, and maybe we're not going to be able to do this in a neat diagram, the data doesn't just sit on naked infrastructure. There's all of the software that's required to manage that data. So if you like, the software sits underneath the data, and maybe, again, I'm just making this up on the fly, maybe we should be avoiding trying to describe the core elements in that way, because that does look like a layered architecture stack, and that does have the hierarchy problems, if I can put it like that you're identifying. Maybe what we need to do is we need to visualize that as three elements that are not stacked top to bottom, but are sort of swirling around in some explicitly different relationship. That's a really good point.
Another piece that I've been mulling over while we've been discussing stuff on the supporting elements front. Now, you mentioned the rules of participation is something that's been kind of coming through as something of importance or of interest, sort of generally around the place. But I wonder if that doesn't fit neatly under governance aspects. To me, it would. That the government would have rules of participation within it. So there's an opportunity to simplify that piece. But and then the other piece was, that human capacity and engagement. Well, the engagement comes through humans, presumably, mostly. And I'm wondering if you wouldn't want to consider merging those two as well. But it may be that you're thinking in terms of human capacity in a different way than just the potential for humans to do the engagement.
So on the first point, the distinction between governance and rules of participation was one that some of our European colleagues felt strongly about, in part because EOSC has rules of participation as a separate thing. I agree that you could probably smudge those together. And that would simplify things down. As to the human capacity, this is why we need definitions. But I think the way we were thinking about human capacity was, to use a term I quite like, but some of my colleagues don't, people as infrastructure. So what's the human infrastructure that you need to make the infrastructure work, to manage the data, to ensure that the software is being written? And that's different to how do you engage with the users of the commons. There's some overlap there, but it's recognizing that you can't just say, oh, here is some technology and it just magically happens. It doesn't. You need to ensure that you have, and you're building the right human capacity to support that infrastructure. So if I can think of an example, one of the challenges for some of the commons that are being put in place in the global south, I'm thinking here about the African Open Science Platform, for instance, is not can they get access to the hardware and the software to run on the hardware, because those are either commodity or available to be downloaded. It's the human capacity to fit that together and run it and make it available that's the challenge. And so that's why we wanted to break that out as a separate item.
Sure. So soft infrastructure type thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me just go back to the questions. So any other, so I think we've kind of covered the first two. Well, maybe not. Any other thoughts on this question of core and supporting elements?
I would just clarify that one of the things that came up in a previous discussion about the topology was that, and I agree with, and I don't know if it was Rory or Frankie that said that the supporting and core weren't necessarily the best terms to be used because supporting implies something
subordinate.
Yeah, subordinate. It is one of the ideas that came up is that all elements are required. So it's not as if the supporting elements are optional in some sense. So so when we do get around to providing the definitions, the idea is that all of them have to be there, certainly in order to be considered adhering to this notion of what we define as a commons. So
yeah, no, that's I'd forgotten that. You're right. That's a really good point. I mean, you could have differing. It's a little bit like your capability maturity model, right? You can have differing levels for each of these. You could say, look, our commons is really going to focus on governance and standards. And we're going to perhaps spend a bit less time worrying about human capacity and rules of participation, but you need to have a bit of all of those, even if you might differ in the levels of emphasis you place on them. My thanks to the anonymous crow, whoever that is, typing stuff in. Well, anonymous crow on my screen. Okay, so maybe if we, one of the things that we spent a bit of time talking about in the previous version of this session was the overarching aspects of governance or rules. So do people have thoughts about what sort of governance or what sort of rules need to be in place to make this work?
I'm wondering if you can't expand for me a bit, Andrew, what the rules of participation tend to be that have been coming through EOSC.
Sure. So the EOSC rules of participation, it's actually quite as you'd expect from the Europeans, a nuanced and I was going to say complex. Complex is a judgment term. Nuanced and comprehensive set of things. But what they were basically focusing on were what are the conditions under which people can provide data to be consumed by the European Open Science Cloud? What are the conditions under which people can provide services to be published as part of the Open Science Cloud? And what are the conditions under which people can gain access to the European Open Science Cloud as users? And part of what they were trying to pin down was the constraints maybe isn't the right word, the boundaries within which private service providers might be able to contribute to the cloud. So for instance, if researchers were contributing data into the cloud for free, would it be possible for a private service provider to download all of that data and start selling it to people? Or would you say, no, the rules of participation don't allow you to do that? If you're providing services into the cloud, do you have to comply with particular rules on personal privacy, for instance, or on not providing precise locations for things in a way that would allow I don't know, rare plant species or archaeological sites to be identified. If you are generating data using or generating outputs using data that's available through the European Open Science Commons, cloud, do you have to make the outputs of those results fair? So it's those kinds of things that the rules of participation were particularly focused on. There's actually quite a nice, I'll dig out the link to the rules of participation document that they developed and link it into the notes, because it's quite a nicely nuanced thing. And one of the things that I was pushing in the Helsinki meeting was this set of rules of participation looks like it's designed by Europeans for Europeans only. What about, in my case, Australians who want to provide services into the cloud or who want to consume data from the cloud? What about Australian researchers who want to collaborate with European researchers on this shared infrastructure? So it was very much around getting them to think through the implications of connecting the European open science cloud into a global infrastructure, and how would the rules of participation enable or disable that, if I can put it like that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. That's helpful. I guess one thing that I've been sort of considering, especially with the recent work I've been doing around a strategy for data for one of our Australian universities, is so I know that the fair data and those sort of principles are principles that are being much better socialized and understood from researchers and institutions as a whole. Mm-hmm. But really the trends that I'm seeing are still very much geared around, well, if you want to get hold of my data, talk to me about it. I'm maybe happy to make it available, but talk to me about it first. So I would really like to see us take it up a notch and sort of turn the screwdriver a little bit and say, actually, if you're to participate in this, the default is your data is open, and only for very good reasons is it then subject to conditions about access. So the default is open, so people don't have to think about it. It just gets up there and it's freely available for all. Perhaps a very open license attached to it, but it's available to all without that extra step of I need to go and contact the data custodian or data generator owner, whatever you want to call it. So really pushing that forward.
Yeah, the phrase
I appreciate.
Yeah, the phrase that, and I can't remember whether this originated in the Data Archiving and Networking Services Group in the Netherlands or somewhere else in Europe, but I certainly first ran into it at Dunce. As open as possible, as closed as necessary. So that
but the default being that open piece,
yes,
instead of it tends to fall back to being the latter half of the statement that becomes the default.
Yeah, I think I agree that you should have certainly, well, we could have a long discussion about fair and open, because fair, of course, does not mean
it's
open.
Not open, yeah.
But I would personally agree that I would like to see as open as possible as the default, and that if you want to keep it closed, you have to make an argument. To keep it closed. Karen, I don't want to squeeze your time. Do you want to perhaps continue this conversation for another 10? Is that going to be okay for you?
I'm fine. One interesting thing I do think regarding a nice intersection between FAIR and the rules of participation, I was talking to at a different session earlier today. There was a question about the future of certifying services. So that you could certify that a data repository is trustworthy for the trust principles, but are there frameworks for certifying different elements as trust, fair, care, and there's another, I feel like I'm forgetting a fourth principle, but in any way they were talking about ways in which approaching how to certify elements of infrastructure. And one of the comments that was made was that the Europeans, as part of their rules of participation, are looking at ways in which those principles can be applied or be required of participants in the cloud or their commons as well. So that's a nice forward-thinking way of using those principles as part of a governance structure and a rules of participation.
Oh, okay. So you're saying that you have principles that apply to the infrastructure, but the same or related principles that apply to the users of that infrastructure.
No, I wasn't thinking that, but I mean, that makes a certain amount of sense. I was just saying that one of the things the Europeans are considering is including in rules of participation evidence of compliance with these larger principles. And I think it's very, there's a long way to go on that, but I do think that that's the direction they're going in.
Okay.
And that evidence may be some sort of certifying body like Portra Seal, or that evidence may be something else. I don't know, but yeah.
Yep. If you can, you can place a reference to the group where that discussion was going on, that would be really helpful.
Yep.
Sorry, I've just seen your comment that you were objecting to the idea that the technology stack is boring.
Oh, you didn't even know you said it when you said it.
So clear that it doesn't need explanation. Does that work better for you?
That's funny.
Are there any, I'm not going to call them supporting elements, are there any cross-cutting elements that we're missing in the diagram? So we've picked up standards and interoperability already. Are there other cross-cutting elements that we should be including?
Can you go back to the diagram?
Yep, sorry.
Please?
Yep, thank you. The only one that occurs to me as I look at it is this notion of social responsibility. But I wonder whether that's too broad and whether that's kind of included or whether that's implied by the fact that we're doing this to support research, and research leads to knowledge, and knowledge is in general a good thing. I don't know.
Again, that one I think could be absorbed by rules of participation. If we took it, you know, if we thought of rules of participation without that EOS definition that's
Flavor,
already,
yeah.
I'm sorry, this is Claudia. I just have a question about this figure, if I may. Is there any order among the supporting elements that?
No.
Is there like a priority? Which are the most important? Which are the most, I don't know, challenging, whatever?
Okay, so thank you. So Claudia Balsa Madeiros is one of the council members, for people who don't know her, from Brazil. So welcome, Claudia. And I apologize for mangling your surname. I probably did, but anyway.
No, you did wonderfully, but let me see what you suggest, or whether there's some, you know, priority in this.
Yeah, so I hadn't even thought about that. I mean, I had thought about the question of priority in the core elements. Really, I think the supporting elements, we were just listing them in the order that they occurred to us. So there's certainly no implied priority there. And it occurs.
I'm sorry, because the core elements you can clearly see, it's not a kind of priority, but the organization that you have infrastructure, and then you have data, and then you have software, right?
Well, interestingly, before you joined us, we were having a discussion about whether software should sit on top of data or the other way around. So we may be getting away from the hierarchy there. But yeah, on the left-hand side, I mean, one of the challenges of doing these things in a global context is that reading left to right, top to bottom is not a language universal. It's one that works for quite a lot of languages, but not all of them. And we should be very careful not to do things in ways that imply sequences. So we need to work out how to fix that.
Okay, thank you.
And sorry, Claudia, for your benefit, the collaborative notes for what we've done so far are in chat now. So are there any other elements there that we could perhaps have that are missing? Or should we be looking to kind of consolidate things a bit more, as Frankie suggested earlier?
Certainly wouldn't want it any more complex in terms of a topology. It could get away from ourselves, I think. I like the simplicity, and I would even like to see fewer supporting elements in it. Not that I don't think that they're important, but somehow, yeah.
Yeah, we can leave the complexity to your working group, Karen.
Well, if you've bundled the elements that you have into infrastructure, I suspect that you can bundle some of the cross-cuttings as well. So,
Yeah,
rules of participation, governance, maybe human capacity and engagement.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Okay. I mean, in an ideal world, we'd have two boxes: core element, supporting element, and then life would be simple. But
Yeah.
that's perhaps going too far. All right, let's have a think about how we might do that. Okay, and then,
sorry, I'm just going to be interested to see what image you come up with. Only because I actually have to admit that I made the rainbow image, and that was a joke, and I never intended somebody to pick it up and put it in slides.
Oh, this one?
Yeah, and you can tell it's a joke, A, because of baby Darth Vader, and B, because the governance are clowns. Like I literally.
Oh, I missed that one.
This is really neat, Karen.
Yeah,
I love the stakeholders.
Can you help me understand the chicken and the standards?
And like with their heads cut off. Like in no way did I intend for this WDS web stack view. Like I really did intend it as a joke one night, and it just got away from me.
Yeah, clearly. Well, it obviously resonates with people. Okay, I'm sorry. We can delete it from the slides if you want, but
no, it's fine. It's fine. A little levity, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So before we move on to the remaining content for this session, are there particular? So we've talked about the importance of defining what some of these terms mean. The CASRAE definitions, and I should actually link to those. One example of a set of definitions that we could draw on. Are there other resources people can suggest that we might want to also look to help define these elements? And Karen will pick up the definition question in a minute.
So yeah, I might introduce the things, the way that the discussion for this other group that I mentioned, the National NRENS group, which Sarah's involved in. So I think it strikes me that I think to me, and I think to that group, those discussions are really focused around the research data lifecycle or the research lifecycle or whatever you want to call it. So there's a dynamism to that, which is expressed by passage of time.
Mm-hmm.
And so it strikes me that the graphic, I realize it's just a proto-graphic, but the proto-graphic which we've been talking to looks quite static. Whereas to me, the whole point of a research data commons is to facilitate the passage of data through the various stages of the cycle, and the tools or the software are just, or shouldn't be, anything more than vehicles for adding value to the data and then passing it on to the software, the vehicles for the other cycles, and those need to be interoperable. So it's expressed, our graphic that we're working to is expressed more as a cycle,
Yep.
the research data cycle, as opposed to this kind of. So I think I'm not saying that that's right necessarily, but I think you're asking for, other benchmarks, other references. I think that would be a good reference.
The question then is, which of the 63,000 different research data life cycles do we pick? There are so many.
But they're all they're all basically it doesn't really matter because they're all they're all the same. Yes, there's slight differences, but so for example, in this group, we're actually creating a new one which takes from the others, but that doesn't mean it's the right. But they're all basically the same. If you look at them, they're quite similar.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, people might quibble about data management planning is. Few people would quibble that the data management planning is an element of the cycle. The data deposit is an element of the cycle. So I think at a high level, it is possible to define fairly commonly recognized elements, which 80 to 90% of the people would agree on. But in any event, to get the notion of passage of time, passage of data, and dynamism somehow into the presentation.
Yeah, that's a really helpful point. Thanks, Rory. Other comments on potential resources that we might want to use? Okay, that's been very useful. Thank you for that. Every time we expose our thinking to a global audience, we get really, really good ideas. And we then go and kind of go, now, how do we incorporate these? But that's our challenge, not your challenge. So thank you for providing some fantastic input there. Now, Karen,
Andrew,
do you want to share? Do you want to switch to sharing your? Oh, Frankie, yeah.
Yeah. Just one comment on that resources and the definitions. Can I suggest that actually be an output? Because I think that would be incredibly valuable if somebody's going to take the time to go through and trawl the World Wide Web for definitions and finding out what sources of information, that collation of that of those resources and into something that people can refer to would be brilliant.
Well, fortunately, Karen's about to talk to you about a Zotero bibliography that her group's pulling together, which may actually answer that question for you.
Winning, good.
But
I have to run though, I'm afraid, at 11,
right.
So I'll catch up on the recording for this, but thank you so much.
Okay, no, thanks, Frankie. Karen, do you want to take over screen sharing or do you want to use me as a remote mouse? What works best for you?
Can I use you as your remote mouse? Do you mind? But if you mind?
No, very, very happy to be a remote mouse. All right, so in that case.
All right. So what I'm going to do, the sections that I want to cover are two different sections. One, I'm starting to get a little feedback. Is that just me? Okay. So I want to talk a bit about some related activities that are going on in the community and how they relate to this working group, this interest group. And following that, I'm going to give an update on what's going on in the working group that's working in conjunction with this interest group. So the first thing that I want to do, I'm grateful to my colleague, Mark Leggett, who couldn't be here today, who had put together these slides. But for those of you who are at all familiar with the space, you probably have heard about the Global Open Science Cloud, which is a co-data initiative that's happening in parallel to our initiative. And so GORC and GOSC often confuses folks. But these are really complementary initiatives. And that we're working hard to make sure that they're well coordinated. So the co-data-led initiative is intended to encourage cooperation and alignment of interoperability. It was launched this past summer, and it's certainly it is going to be using the GORC topology and the outputs from the model, the working group going forward, and the work that we do is certainly going to be informed by them as well. Go ahead, next slide. So the GOSC, the Co-Data Initiative, has 4 thematic working groups: governance and sustainability, policy and legal dimensions, technical infrastructure, and data interoperability. And you know that now, given our previous discussion, that these are all well covered under the topology of the commons that we look at. Next slide, Andrew.
Oh, sorry, and just before I hit the next slide, link to these slides is in the collaborative notes document that is connected from the session description. And as you can see from these slides, there's links to further detail about what each of these working groups is doing. So if you want to follow up on them, go to the slides and you can then use those links to find out exactly what's going on inside data interoperability, for instance. But these working groups have only just started, right, Karen? They're still at early stages.
That's right. The work
Okay.
are in early stages, and they are, and I was actually going to spend some time on the case studies just because that's where sort of the rubber meets the road in terms of what they're actually looking at. At least
Those ones.
Yeah, these ones. And they are still recruiting for case studies or for participants in the case studies or for other examples that they might use. So that they have 5 case studies at the minute. One is looking at radar data. They have radar data from Northern Europe or Northern Scandinavia, and radar data from the Chinese Academy of Sciences at low latitude. So they're comparing high altitude and low latitude radar data. And so they're looking at data management issues surrounding continuous measurements and large scale data sets and transferring them and managing them online in the first case study. In the second case study, they're looking at biodiversity and ecology information, particularly associated with trap data, video and images that are associated with mammal trapping. And so
night, everyone.
Bye, Rory.
Thanks a lot.
That's what happens. Yeah,
thanks.
I understand. But so they have a large amount of imagery data from camera traps and working in a cloud environment. And so they're looking at how to steward that data, looking at possible AI methods for analyzing that data. And so that data is coming from the Chinese Biodiversity Observation Network. The third case study is associated with climate change and natural disasters. And the data here is looking at the Chinese Big Earth Data Science Engineering Program, or CASE Earth, which is part of the Digital Belt and Road Initiative. And so they're looking at data sharing and online computing resource sharing for evaluating SDG indicators. And so they're looking in particular at cross-border data exchanges with other members of the Digital Belt and Road Initiative, and in this case, in particular, with representatives from Bangkok, Zambia, and Morocco, in addition to the Chinese Big Earth program. And then the fourth case study is looking at creating a set of compliant fair data points for serving fair digital objects for reusable health data. And so a lot of this touches on the GDPR compliant and the privacy issues that we were talking about earlier. And then the last case study is associated with diffraction data for protein research, which is associated with Osaka University in Japan, that has wanting to use protein crystallography for drug discovery. And I'm really outside of my element here, so I feel like I can't talk about that intelligently. But they are looking in particular at controlled versioning for these protein data bank entries. And it has a community element to it because they want to create community reviewers of data models as well as part of the reusability process. So one of the questions that comes up quite often is, what is the difference between the GORC and GOS projects? And as I said earlier, I think they really are complementary projects. The GORC topology, and I compared the GORC topology with the working group and the working groups and case studies in the GOS, and I found that they're really well represented there. And so I do also think that currently the GOS program is looking at a lot of, because of the funding situation, it's a lot of Chinese assets and how they can make those assets interoperable, especially with the European Open Science Cloud, and along with some other individual platforms, especially associated with the African Open Science Platform. So I do think that they're really complementary. I think organizers of both of the initiatives believe that open science is the way forward and that we should try to bridge those digital divides. to the extent possible. And we will certainly be looking at their outputs as we create the roadmap for the interest group going forward. And that's something I'll talk about in particular with the working group.
Okay.
So, next slide, Andrew. The other initiative in this space that is ongoing and was also launched this summer is called OSCAR, which is the Open Science Commons Executive Roundtable. And it's meant to be a forum for CEOs of science clouds or science commons to exchange views and cooperate. So it's a coordination mechanism for CEOs and others at that level, very non-technical level as far as I can tell. There's current representation from EOSC, the Chinese Science Technology Cloud, African Open Science Platform, excuse me, the Australians, the Canadians, the Malaysian Open Science Platform, and La Referencia in Latin America. So there are also observers to OSCAR from CodeData, GoFair, RDA, WDS. So it is well coordinated. I will also say that the set of observers, CodeData, GoFair, RDA, and WDS have also signed a data together agreement, which indicates that we are working together to make sure that our initiatives are coordinated and don't waste resources in any way. And we have ongoing regular meetings particularly with the GORC and GOSC to check in with each other and to make sure that we're exchanging information. So I feel like we're well coordinated and with plenty of mechanisms to make sure that we're all rowing in the same direction.
I'll add a link to the data together agreement, Karen.
Thank you. Next slide, if you got it. So yes, and then I'm gonna pause there, or should I pause here, Andrew, or just barrel?
Yeah, maybe pause there and see if anyone has any questions on the GORC thing.
Any GORC and GOSC?
I have what we would call in my part of the world a Dorothy Dixer question, which is a question that gets asked in Parliament when the person knows what the answer is, but I'll do it anyway. So Karen, I note a number of Chinese connections for the GOSC. Could you perhaps explain why?
I think, and I sort of alluded to this, that they are the major funders of the GOSC initiative. So they provided funding to CodeData. And so that is, they are willing to put themselves forward as case studies and as test beds to help solve some of these interoperability issues. And I think that's the answer to that. So yeah, so okay. Certainly are looking for other participants and other organizations. It's certainly not only Chinese infrastructure that they're looking at, but that's why there's they're putting themselves out forward to help build this out.
Okay. Any other questions on the GOSC before we move on to the working group that Karen chairs? Okay, I say go for it, Karen.
Okay, so as Andrew mentioned earlier, the GORC interest group recently spun up their first working group, which is the International Model Working Group. And you might have heard us referred to as the International Model or International Benchmarking Group. But there were some exceptions to that language, and so now we're the International Model Working Group, and we were endorsed last summer. So we're glad to hear that. So what I'll do in the next set of slides is just recap what we said we're going to do, and then talk about how we're moving forward and what we're doing, what we've already established, and then what we're going to do going forward. So go ahead, Andrew, on the next slide. So the idea behind the International Model Working Group was that there was an idea that it would be helpful to gather up observations of features and services that you would expect to find within a commons. And so part of the charter lists a set of what we anticipated listing as this, which are things like existence of federated authentication and authorization, or a mechanism for creating vocabulary services, or a process to inventory research artifacts, an open catalog of services, these types of things that you would expect to find within a commons. And so in addition to that, in addition to finding what types of things that you would expect to have, the existence of a governance structure of some sort. We wanted to try to capture performance metrics or KPIs. How do you know, how are Commons currently measuring user engagement with these services? How are you measuring maturity of your governance structure? How are you measuring success of your investments? And so the idea is that the working group is going to create this framework that we can capture the observations of the types of features that you would expect to find in Commons, and then create a set of recommendations or an adoption plan, which is actually going to be part of the roadmap for the Commons integration that the interest group is creating. So the interest group, one of the outputs from the interest group is going to be a roadmap for the future, and one of our outputs of observations about what currently exists is going to contribute to that. So we have a regular monthly meetings on the fourth Thursday of every month. And we have a set of collaborative spaces that are up and running in addition, and you can get through all of these through the RDA website. So the RDA has a page for the working group, and we have a wiki, and we have all the information there that you need. But we are starting with a sort of straw man document so we don't know, I should say, we don't know exactly what the output is going to look like from the group. For certain, we are going to have a narrative document of some kind. We might also try to create some sort of database or table or visualization of some sort, looking at these different services and different commons across the world. We don't know what that's going to look like yet, but we're starting with a narrative document. That narrative document gets regularly output to a PDF that's available on the RDA site for our colleagues who can't access Google services. We have as a Terra instance, we have a library of documents that we are going to review that are we've collected from Commons, different Commons organizations, and we have the regular meetings. So that's sort of how we're going forward. Next slide, Andrew. And so I want to talk a bit about in particular, the Zotero instance. As part of setting up this Zotero library, we wanted to create a tagging system so that we could organize the literature that we wanted to review. And that what we're seeing is that the tagging system that we created, or the set of tags that we created, can serve a dual purpose. It can help organize the literature, but it also may help us in terms of organizing the narrative document created, possibly help us organize any subtask groups that we have going forward. And so we have 4 sets of tags. And as always, we're trying to look to international standards to the extent possible. So for example, we wanted to have a tag for the domains that are being served, or the domains that are being referenced in the literature that we review, and we're using the OECD list of domains for that. For regions or areas of the world, we're using a UN geoscheme from the UN Statistics Division. Of course, we're using the GORC topology, which needs to be updated in light of the most recent iteration of the GORC topology. And we're using the eInfraCentral classification of research infrastructures. And it's this last one that we've spent a little bit of time during this plenary session working on. And so I wanted to talk a bit more about that in particular. But for those of you who are not familiar, next slide, Andrew, the eInfra standard, and we're up to version 3 now. eInfra standard is the underlying metadata standard that's used to populate the European Open Science Cloud catalog of services. So if you go to the OSC marketplace and you see, these are the services that we offer. This is the catalog standard that's being used to create that. It's also been used in OpenAIRE uses it. Catris also uses it. It's just a really good and well-developed way of cataloging infrastructure. So there are 20 categories, 6 super categories. The 6 super categories here at the top level, and then 20 categories, and then a whole suite of subcategories under that. And so again, we are creating tags to identify documents that talk about, for example, material storage or education and training or whatever it may be. Next slide, Andrew. So one of the things that we did, and so it's as part of the EA for standard. So again, there's the super categories and then the categories, for example, of material storage, and then some definitions of what that might be, but then a whole suite of subcategories of different types of material storage that might be. And so again, I think it's a jumping off point. And one of the ways that we're intending to use this, so as I mentioned, we are going to, we're looking at this as a way of classifying some of the, organizing some of the documentation, possibly organizing the narrative document that we're creating. But also one of the purposes of the working group, which is a bit distinct from the GOS working group, I think, is that we are looking at a whole suite of science commons. And we want to have a sense of what the science commons are currently serving and what they're currently providing. And so one of the things that we're doing going forward, next slide, Andrew, is that we're creating a speaker series within the working group. And so we're going to be inviting speakers from all of the set of commons that we're reviewing, and I'll talk about those in just a second. And so we are generating, as part of this RDA plenary, what we're doing is generating a list of questions, a common set of questions that we're asking all the speakers to address about their commons. So so that we can try to understand how the commons are different and how they're the same, and how they satisfy different elements of the topology. One of the things that the E-Infra standard does quite well is catalog research infrastructure, but we really need the topology in order to find a place to document things that aren't captured in that research infrastructure checklist, things about like governance structure and sustainability. But those subcategories, those multiple subcategories, one of the things we're hoping to do is use it as a checklist against all of the commons that we look at and say, okay, which of these services or which of these types of resources are you providing through your commons? Are there elements that you're providing through your commons that are not captured in this? And so that we have a sense of who's providing what kind of services where. So we have this common speaker series. The first one is coming up later this month. Francois General is going to talk to us about the International Virtual Observatory Alliance. And again, we'll have a common set of questions and a checklist to see what they're providing to the community and anything else that they want to tell us. And we're trying to lean into the working group to sort of adopt a commons so that we have people who will commit to reading the Zotero resources associated with that commons and prior to the speaker session so that we can have some intelligent conversations about what they're providing. Yeah, next slide, Andrew. So the other thing that is, settling but not settled is which commons we are going to review. This is our current set of commons. The initial charter for the working group was much more extensive, and this is much more pared down. We currently have a list of 13 commons that we're going to be reviewing, and considering that the working group is intending to run just a little over a year, I think that that's about the limit of what we probably could do. But there are questions about whether, for example, one of the things that came up during this plenary was whether or not Gaia X should be included, or whether or not we should include the Malaysian Open Science Platform, which isn't on here. So I think there's a little room for shifting here, but largely speaking, this is where we're starting. These are the commons that we're hoping to provide an overview of. And yeah, that's where we are with the working group. And I'm going to pause again here. That's the last slide I have, Andrew, before we go into the interest group. Next slide.
Okay, thanks.
Yep, and I will open the floor up for any questions, discussions, anything you want to say about the working group or anything else. And if you've got any questions that you think you would like to know about all of the commons that we review, please either put them in the notes or let me know. And again, we're creating this list of questions for our speaker series going forward.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions for Karen on that?
I just want to say this is really neat. And I like the idea of the speakers.
I'll listen to fresh laws anytime. Yep. Yeah, for sure. The speakers are great. Don't be surprised if we start tapping folks on the shoulders or asking you to tap folks on the shoulders if you know them. Because it's a big ask to ask people to do that for us, but we really do appreciate it.
I guess the only comment I'd make, Karen, is that, I mean, if I look at that list, they're very different kinds of things, and they're at very different stages of maturity. So I think it's going to be very helpful to try and characterize each of those using a common framework as a way of getting a sense of what's going on across the world and potential points for connection. So I think this is going to be a hugely valuable piece of work.
I mostly feel like I'm in a constant state of failure, and that I'm worried about that. But I appreciate that. It's a good working group, and I have faith in my co-chairs. I'll say that, and I can say that because Andrew and Mark Leggett are co-chairs on this working group. So
I'm sorry, I just have a question.
Okay.
What's the present state of the African Open Science Platform?
That's a really good question. I don't know for sure, and it's definitely one of our top platforms to have a look at. I get confused about the African Open Science Platform. I do know that I feel like they were going to hire a director, and they hired it, but they didn't announce who it was, or if they announced it, I missed it for the platform. But I get confused a lot with the African systems, because I don't know where the African Open Science Platform starts and the Geo initiatives stop, or they're all the same thing. Like, I have not looked at that closely enough, and that's one of the things I'm hoping to tease out in the working group, Claudia, because that's a really good question.
Okay, well, thank you. I just wondered because, okay, thank you.
Yeah, and my answer, Claudia, would have been even less useful. I would have said, I believe it's still in startup, which is not particularly helpful.
Okay, thank you.
And I also get.
I'm sorry, under with support from the Australians, they did set up a new data cube out there recently, if I'm not mistaken. And I don't know if that's part of the African Open Science Platform or if that's something entirely separate, but yeah, sorry.
Yeah, and I get confused about the relationship between the African Open Science Platform and the stuff that's happening in South Africa. And I understand that there are political dimensions to some of that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, just as an aside, I was at a SciDate week, I think it was last week, Codate week.
Yeah.
And there was a panel with someone from Botswana who claimed to, or so understood, to have the center of lots of the processing in Africa. So I don't know whether it's part of the platform, whether it's a parallel, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm equally confused, Claudia, I'm sorry. Okay, so in the remaining 5 minutes, let me just summarize. So Karen's given us a very good sense of what's happening in the model working group. Let me just summarize what's going to be happening in the interest group between now and the next, well, I was going to say it's the next plenary meeting. It's the next plenary as part of International Data Week. So International Data Week in next year is happening in June or July, I can never remember which, in Seoul in Korea, South Korea. And so that's the next, and the next RDA plenary will be part of International Data Week. So between now and then, we want to finalize this diagram, trying to incorporate all of the comments that we got in this session and the previous version of this session earlier in this plenary. We want to continue to provide space for discussion between those who are building commons infrastructures. We do need to sort out a regular program of meetings for people who want to contribute to the interest group. Obviously, we want to support the work of the International Model Working Group that Karen's just described, and we want to continue to foster coordination between GORC and GOSC and make sure that the different activities of those groups are at least coordinated so that we're not duplicating work, because there's a lot of work to do and a finite number of people to do it. We don't want to waste people's time. So that's our plans for the next 6 months. I hope that's been useful. If you're not a member of the interest group, I'd encourage you to join online through the RDA website. I would also encourage you to, if you found this conversation interesting, I'd encourage you to scroll back in the notes document for this session and review some of the discussion that took place in the first version of this session. Some of it overlapping in things that were discussed, some of it going in different directions as well. So there's some very useful content in the earlier version. And I'd just like to close by thanking Karen for joining me in running this session, and you for joining. Any final words from you, Karen?
Sorry, no, just really glad folks taking time to join us. I really do appreciate that, and I appreciate my co-chairs for helping put it together. That's great. Great.
All right, thank you all. And if you have more plenary sessions that you're planning on joining, I hope you find them good. And we hope to see some of you at the next time we run this. And I will put the link to chat. I'll put the chat material in the notes document, and the recording of this session, I believe, will be made available within the next 24 hours or so. All right. Thanks all.
And have a nice evening, the two of you. I guess it's really like, I don't know, it's late.
Middle of the day for me, Claudia. I'm coming up to lunchtime. It's very easy.
Oh, okay. I'm all getting all mixed up. Okay.